Welcome back. Max is in the house, and what a house it is as well. Marvel Stadium, Max. How about that?
Oh, an incredible backdrop. I mean, for those who are listening on, you really need to check out the YouTube to see what's behind us. But we've got the most incredible view of the Docklands Stadium, Marvel Stadium, from the Altus Room, which is one of the very upper class, let's say, dining areas in the stadium.
Yeah, and a special guest coming up from the AFL.
Yeah, an incredible guest, one of, I'd say, Australia's most experienced development people, and he's come to apply his trade at the AFL, so we'll learn a lot from him shortly.
Okay, the recent Productivity Commission finding on housing, it wasn't too great on innovation. How did you read those findings in moving forward with solutions? Do you think we need wholesale policy changes, and who are the agents of change in that respect?
Yeah, I mean, there were some pretty incredible findings that came out earlier in the year. Probably the most shocking thing really was that we're now building as many houses per capita in Australia as we were in 1970. So in 50 years, we've actually gone backwards in terms of how well we're building housing. And it's a huge problem, not just for the housing sector, but for construction generally, where things are just taking longer, costing more, and getting less as a result. So it's an enormous challenge that we have to face around the country. And it's going to take a combined effort from a lot of different levels to try and make this happen. Part of it is, regulatory. It's all the red tape that we talk about all the time. Like, that's a really big factor in just slowing down processes and delivery on site, or even getting to site in the first place. And that's a major drag on productivity. But it's also about some of the sort of tax and company settings that make a difference, which are really more in the domain of the federal government.
What about reform, though? It can be bogged down from a lot of independent reviews and a lot of inactivity from very expensive, mechanisms like that. How can we get more effective reform and execution of that reform?
Well, I guess someone needs to own it. Like, you really need someone in charge who can hear from all the stakeholders but ultimately make a decision, because otherwise you end up in death by a thousand cuts, with everyone having a different view on where it is, and ultimately the reform fails. So if we're very clear that we want to get to a place, and the ultimate reform we need right now is to get more houses on the ground faster, you need to have someone that is really capable and given the authority of saying, actually, this is how we're going to get there. Now, again, that needs a level of coordination that's probably beyond the Australian government level at the moment, but it's the sort of thing you would need to do. And look, if I were in charge, I'd probably break this down to a couple of different areas. You need to be able to solve the short-term problem, because that's only getting worse. Approvals are getting worse, completions are getting worse rather than better, despite all the rhetoric. You need to really hone in and focus in on getting as much stuff approved now that makes sense, while you're working on some of those longer-term, more structural reform pieces in the longer term. And at the moment, there's a lot of sort of looking forward. We're going to change things that might make an impact in 10, 15 years, and they're worthy things to do, but it's actually coming at the expense of getting stuff on the ground right now. So you end up making the problem so much worse without dealing with it now.
Okay, this is explainers and solutions. It's not a quiz, but it's pretty close, Max. So what does land supply really mean?
Well, essentially it means you've got land that's capable of being turned into something. I think it's a really poorly understood thing, and actually I wouldn't mind getting your view on it. What does it mean to you before I sort of jump into the detail?
What it means to me is it means property ownership. That's what land means to me, but it means a whole lot more to councils and communities, where public space can be important, but I think to an individual it's about housing. So
one of the other issues we have is land supply, and it's probably really weird that in a country the size of Australia, land supply is an issue. Like, when I say land supply, Bash, what does that mean to you?
It means owning a house. Now, I know it means different things to different people, like a council can be public space, but to an individual it means owning a house in Australia.
Yeah, and so being able to create that place is really what we try to do on a daily basis. But to create a new house, you've got to be able to get the land to the point where it can actually be developed. And there are so many things along the way that stop you or delay you getting to that point. So when industry talks about land supply, it's not about having land, because there's obviously tons of it around the country. It's having land that has all the capacity sorted out to allow it to be turned into something, i.e. a dwelling. So it needs to have the appropriate utilities and infrastructure and services available. It needs to have the right zoning. It needs to have all the planning approvals. You need to have all the financing ready. You need to have the builder ready to build the thing. There are so many elements, and all of those areas need to have a level of refinement, of regulatory reform, and lined up so you can make the process of getting from an idea to getting a house built much, much, much shorter and cheaper for that matter.
Okay, what's the issue with using apartments to solve the housing crisis in Australia?
Well, it's a great question. And one of the things that we've seen in Australia is a real focus on trying to increase density, and density being sort of touted as a solution to new housing supply. But the trouble is it's slow. The Productivity Commission found that the time to build an apartment building has blown out from 18 months to almost 3 years, which is a very, very material increase in the time frame, and that's a productivity challenge. But there's also the underlying costs of construction. And so when you're building a mid to high-rise building, you're starting to compete more with the same labour pool that's building the big infrastructure projects. And they have work for the next 20 plus years across Australian big states and big cities. And so the more you're competing with that labour pool, the more expensive it is. And that just flows back into the cost of development. And at the moment, what you're finding is the cost to a developer to build something is greater than what they could sell it for in the market. And as long as that's the case, you're not going to be seeing things getting built. And that's precisely what we're seeing at the moment.
Is that partly due to the fact that planning is politics and it's really sort of wedging any progression with investment in that space?
Look, partially, and some of the bigger states like New South Wales and Victoria are really trying to address that at the moment. They're trying to sort of depoliticise some of the planning system, but they're only focusing on one small element of it. And yes, depoliticisation of planning is necessary, but it of itself is not going to solve the feasibility challenge because it only deals with one very small component of the process. We actually, if we want to build more housing, need to make the cost of it less expensive. And what we're seeing at the moment is there's this continued push to actually make things more expensive through regulation or requirements, or again, that sort of productivity issue, which means that builders need to take longer to build stuff. They need to cover the overheads longer. They can't get the sort of sequencing on the site working as well as they otherwise need. And that just means that it's actually a more costly product to deliver than other alternatives.
Okay, politically, socially, economically, what if we don't meet those housing targets?
Well, we're not going to. That's the reality. In fact, the most recent data which came out on approvals, which are really a lead indicator of how many houses will be complete. But at the moment, we're about 33% off the annual approvals you would need to deliver the federal government's 1.2 million homes target, let's call it that. We've got zero chance of getting there. UDAA predicted that we're going to be about 330 odd thousand short over that 5-year period. The federal government's own Housing Supply and Affordability Council said they'll be about 260 odd thousand short. It'll be somewhere in that range, but whatever it is, we're going to be well short. And if population continues to grow, which it's projected to, we're going to see house prices get higher. We're going to see housing get more crowded because people have to be sharing in rentals or living with other people to pay a mortgage. It's not going to be a good outcome for the broader economy because people are spending more of their income on having to have housing. So it's a huge structural economic challenge for the country if we don't get this right and soon.
Max, there is a reason we're here, isn't there?
Yes, we've come here not just to look at the wonderful view behind us, but we've got an amazing guest joining us in a moment. Someone that I've known for the best part of a decade. Incredible experience in development in terms of private sector, everything from retirement to apartments and so forth. But now he's applying his trade, working for the AFL and helping them with the rollout of their infrastructure and so many other things. So very lucky to have Matt on with us.
Matthew Chun is the Executive General Manager, Finance, Clubs and Infrastructure at the AFL. Matthew, welcome along. Thanks for inviting us to your backyard.
Pleasure. Love having people in our backyard.
What a backyard. What about the redevelopment of Marvel Stadium, completed a couple of years ago, but 25 years old? You wouldn't believe the stadium is that old.
No, and look, it's still the only stadium in Australia with a roof and a retractable roof, so we're really proud of that. That development was a really well thought through project, which was a joint venture really with the state government. So the state government funded it, and the deal basically was their focus was to keep the grand final here. And so, as you've probably seen I think what's happened around the country really over the last 20 to 30 years, having major events in cities is really important. So keeping the grand final here was crucially important. So by providing $225 million to refurbish the stadium, which, as you said, is now 25 years old, needed it, our contribution back to the state was to ensure the grand final stays here for 30 years. So that was the deal. And we've been able to use that money to effectively improve probably three main things. So the entry and exit from this stadium. Again, when this stadium was built, I suppose understanding how people would flow from the stadium wasn't really known. And like all stadiums, there's an even number of gates that go all around the stadium. But because it's so close to Southern Cross Station, and gates 2 and 3 are basically on that doorstep, everyone goes through those two gates. And so when you've got 40,000, 50,000, sometimes we have 60, 70 on concerts, trying to get everyone through two gates is really hard. And so by redeveloping it, we're able to completely change the gate orientation. And our three main gates 2, 3 and 5, we doubled the size of those. So now the flow of egress and ingress is much better. So that was one. The second thing was ensuring that our function rooms were, I suppose, what you'd expect in 2025. And so double height ceilings, well orientated in terms of a square format rather than a rectangular format, great views of the city. So the ability for whether it's an AFL team hosting their president's lunch or whether it's a VIP function pre-concert, all of those areas are used wonderfully well now on event day, but also the ability now to leverage that from a Monday to Friday, whether it's for a strategy day, whether it's for a conference, all of those things, we're getting great use out of it. And then the third thing is to open the stadium up on a Monday to Friday. And so this stadium was built, we were talking off air before, nothing was here when this stadium was built. And the whole idea of building this stadium so close to the city was to give Docklands a kick and enable Docklands to start being developed. And that's happened. There's now 40,000 people living and working in this precinct. Three main areas that have been developed by Mirvac, Lendlease and MAB. And that's all really transpired since 2000 and they're all coming to an end now. And so that's worked really well. What now we're seeing is the stadium is a bit of a blocker between the city and Docklands. And so a big piece of the work was how can we open the stadium up on a Monday to Friday when we don't have an event here and there's still activity. And so on the part of the stadium that is the interface between the city and Docklands, we've opened that up. We now have a cafe and we have a bar and all of those things enable Monday to Friday activity. And then we have various different events that are free. And so today there's an NBA final happening. We've got an NBA activation in that square. We've got a big screen. We call it the Fed Square of Docklands. And we're really just in the infancy of that. We've had Super Bowl. We envisage having the tennis here, the Grand Prix, all of these big major events that we can have on a screen and have people come and enjoy the amenity that we've now created. And then that creates some activation. And activation in any large-scale development is crucially important. And so this is we call the entree to what is a much larger development. But if we can get people to have that interface between the city and the water by coming through it and having things to, I suppose, enjoy on the way through, that's the first piece of a much bigger puzzle.
And I suppose that's the benefit of Melbourne. It's the beauty of Melbourne. You've got an extensive corporate background in property, ex-CEO of Simmons Homes and Becton CEO. Broadly, how does property sit in both the professional and community space with the AFL?
Yeah, so obviously property, real estate is especially important. If you have a look at what's sitting behind us, we're sitting on about 40,000 square metres of real estate. And getting this sort of real estate near the city is not easy. And so real estate is crucially important, and where stadiums are located is critically important. And then they're big assets, and so they require lots of redevelopment and maintenance, etc. So there's a lot in that, and what you're seeing with stadiums throughout the world is how can you sweat the asset a bit more. And so very rarely can you have events outside of the weekend. So any stadium, really, you're working on probably a Thursday to a Sunday. And so you might be able to get 80 to 100 events. And so it's sitting idle a lot of the time. So how can you get the asset working more, particularly when it's located close to a city. So there's a lot of real estate development work that comes into that. And then each of our clubs basically have their own training and administrative facility, and they're big projects now. Each of them are 100 million type projects. They have the indoor kicking field. Sometimes they'll have 2 ovals, they'll have their offices, and then they're all trying to find ways to commercialise elements of those, whether it's function rooms, cafes, bars, etc. And so real estate has become, over really the last 20 or 30 years, crucially important to the league, whether we own the asset like we do at Marvel, or in every stadium around the country, we're the main tenant. And so we provide the bulk of content, and so we then have a pretty good say in terms of how that stadium is developed, in terms of making it fit for purpose for AFL footy.
Look, having experienced it, it's a fantastic facility, and we've been having conversations about things like productivity and cost as well. And one of the things that really struck me looking at how the redevelopment went was the fact that it came in under budget at a time where virtually every other project around the place is not falling within those parameters. So what did the AFL do that made it possible to actually stick to the numbers that it had?
Yeah, there's a long answer to that, so I'll try and summarise it. I think there's a number of critical components to, I think, ensuring a big infrastructure asset is delivered on time, on budget. We had a lot of challenges that probably weren't normal in that COVID came. We're sort of right in the middle of our design phase. We had to keep the stadium alive and open every event, so we never closed the stadium during that whole redevelopment, and that's challenging in its own right. I think we, as the AFL, insisted right from the start that we had to manage it, and the government were our partner in terms of funding, and so they believed in us. That was helpful, and they were a great partner in terms of giving us all the support we needed. From the AFL's perspective, selfishly, I suppose they tried to find the best property people they could, and I was chosen to run it. And so having, I think, people who have deep development background helped, and we put together a great team. We then had external project managers and great consultants. And then it's about making sure that the brief is heavily detailed, and when the builders were able to then quote and bid for the job, they knew what they were bidding for. And then we had a pretty good design path from there to work with the builder to try and find some savings along the way, but then ensuring it was built. The three variables I always think about when you're developing is building on time, on budget, and quality. And so you're never going to get all three. And so you're always going to be negotiating or giving on some. And so cost was obviously crucially important. So we brought it in on budget. We were probably 3 or 4 months behind. Time wasn't a huge issue for us though, because it's not like we didn't have any debt. So it's not like an apartment project where every day that's late you're paying more interest. Sure, we didn't lose any capacity either. So it wasn't like when we were building this stadium that we had any negative impact on capacity, so we still had that. But we did have some impact on our function rooms, and obviously that revenue was somewhat reduced during that period of time. So whilst time was important, it was the one that we could flex on. We couldn't flex on quality and we couldn't flex on cost, so we flexed on time. And by using that gave all of the participants in the project, I think, a way to get through a really challenging period where, supply was unbelievably hard, delivery of all of our materials, labour was really hard, and then we had to deal with all of the mask and all of the conditions that we had to work, not have too many builders on site, all of those things, which again, because we had the luxury of time, we were able to navigate through that without having, I suppose, large penalties with the builder or with us. So there's some things, there's a lot to that answer, but really proud of, I suppose, the partnership with the government. John Holland with the builder, Grimshaw with the architects, PwC were the project manager. And so each of those participants, we all worked as a really cohesive team. And I think having a great team obviously helps as well.
Matthew, the Tassie Devils licence and the Macquarie Point proposed redevelopment, it's very politically charged now
it is,
in Tasmania. Do you think that the average Tasmanian realises how much benefit, away from the actual sporting licence, that precinct and the proposed redevelopment will benefit Hobart?
I think it's been lost a little bit in the conversation. And I don't think anyone realises the benefit until you live it. And I think Adelaide is proof of that. Optus Oval in Perth is proof of that. And we're proof of that. Since the redevelopment here, which finished at the end of 23, last year we had probably pretty close to the busiest period we've ever had in this stadium. Over 2.5 million people through this stadium in 12 months. And in October, we were the busiest stadium in the world. We had Coldplay through for 4 big concerts. We had a number of other, Travis Scott, a number of other big artists through that period of time. But we did some analysis just recently, actually. 30% of participants who came to those concerts were either interstate or overseas. So if you think about that, there were 600,000 odd people through that month. 200,000 or approximately 200,000 of those people have come from interstate, probably stayed at a hotel, probably spent some money at a restaurant. And so the multiplier of that through the economy is significant. And I'm absolutely convinced that Tasmania is such a great place to go and visit now. You add a stadium and more events, the ripple effect through there will be unbelievable. I mean, Mona has been an amazing ripple effect for that economy, and that's that big in terms of what a stadium will do to that economy. So I think once we get through, and there's never a good time to build a stadium. There's always going to be a conversation around can you spend the money on health and education, and they're all great conversations. But ultimately, I think this investment, whilst big, in the scheme of what that will do for the economy will be unbelievable. And then the proceeds from that, you'll be able to reinvest 10 times into health and education. So.
Yeah, I don't think that's actually been raised in the conversation enough.
Yeah.
The macro benefit to not just Hobart, but Tasmanian society.
Totally. And look, it was a big piece when we did the feasibility and all of the analysis on the 19th team. It was crucially important for us to make sure this club can stand alone on its own 2 feet. Having a stadium is a big part of any football club's economy, but we also knew that there's no way that we could convince a state government and a federal government to invest money into a stadium if it didn't have a much bigger use. And hence why having a roof, we know how important a roof is. Having a roof opens the doors to so many more events, whether it's a graduation, whether it's a motocross event, which has to be, in an environment that can't be impacted by weather. And then all of the concerts who can book here with absolute confidence, they don't have to worry about weather. And so there's lots of debates in Tasmania about how cold it is or not, or how much rain there is or not. Ultimately, it just gives confidence. And in all of these things, the more confidence you have, the more people that will come, the more events you can have, and that is the impact that I think will be amazing once it gets done. And I'm still very confident it will get done. It's just we have to just work through the politics.
Yeah. Well, isn't Marble the perfect example of that? The fact that you can prove just how game-changing a stadium in the right place in a major city can be in terms of transforming and activating it.
Totally. And the site at Macquarie Point is not dissimilar to Docklands. It's a port area. There's really been nothing on it for a long period of time. It sits right on the edge of the city. The remodelling of that precinct, because I think once the stadium comes, there'll be lots of things that will come with it. Hotels are already in short supply in Hobart, so it will absolutely generate hotel. It'll absolutely generate some residential accommodation, no different than what you see around here. And it sits right on a beautiful harbour that from a the amenity and the perspective when you're sitting down at that site is amazing. So that's going to drive private investment, which I think will help fund the project.
Now, just on a lighter note, Max will love this story. We're in a premium corporate facility, and there's a little bit of a story about Shane Warne in this room. Can you share it?
Sure. So this is and I would say there is no more premium location in a stadium in Australia than Altus. And so we relaunched this a couple of years ago, and it's in its second year of operation. And It's a very exclusive area. It's limited to 40 to 50 members. There's fine dining. You have very private seats in a great vantage point. And Shane Warne, as you all know, is an avid St Kilda footy fan. Used to come here a lot. Was a great member. And we have everything from oysters to Wagyu beef to an amazing menu here that you can really choose whatever you want. You even have your own private whiskey storage, but he was very insistent on having Vegemite sandwiches here. And so true to what you hear about Shane, he loved his footy, he loved the simple life, and loved sharing it with his mates, and a lot of fond memories of Shane Warne here.
Absolutely, yeah. What about overall AFLW? Is that been a great conduit for the AFL to reconnect with suburban stadia and communities and societal benefits that flow from that?
Yeah, look, AFLW has done amazing things, and a father of 3 daughters that all play. I'm a little biased, but what it's done in terms of participation has been unbelievable. What it's done for women coming to our game in big numbers has changed, and so the demographic of people coming to an AFL game, and then what it's done to our workforce. We have more women working in AFL head office than men. Now, 10 years ago, that wouldn't have been the case. And we have great representation at all levels, whether it's commission, executive, all the way down. And I'm sure AFLW has played a role in that. And then in terms of, from a real estate perspective, what we see is playing these games at Windy Hill or Victoria Park and all of these great grounds that we all grew up going to, and they are the heartbeat of these communities that people love. And so being able to bring that back has been just a great joy to a lot of people, and we see that. And so you'll see us really push this year, and the fixtures out, having more games at these venues and games in great time slots. So go back to when we were all growing up, at 2 o'clock on a Saturday. There's lots of those slots now, so the fans can come and enjoy it in a really family-friendly time, in an environment that is very family-friendly and also much more engaging with the players. And so one thing we love about AFLW cohort is their engagement with the fans post-game. So they'll stand there for half an hour, 40 minutes after a game, getting selfies, signing, and it's just a great highlight that you can't really do in a men's game now, just because of, I suppose, the size of crowds and the security measures we have at these bigger venues.
So AFLW has kind of taken on the role of the old sort of VFL, AFL when you had the suburban grounds. And, one thing that you always think about when you come to Docklands Stadium is the fact that it came at the expense of Waverley Park, which closed just before this opened. So do you still think that was the right idea, the right decision at the time? What do you think Waverley would have done in today's world?
Yeah. We look back on that a lot, and it's something we talk about as being transformational decisions that, again, one of the unique parts of our sport is having an independent commission, and they make some pretty significant decisions, and granting a new licence is a big one, but also selling Waverley and parlaying that into here was a big decision. And if you have a look now around the world, and if you just stay in Australia, Adelaide moved from Football Park, which again was a suburban ground, into Adelaide Oval. And I think, and COVID taught us this too, since COVID and when people couldn't go out and experience footy, people want an experience. And the experience is much bigger than just going to the footy. We also have a lot of competition. And so again, when we were growing up, you couldn't watch a lot of the games, and so you had to go to the games. You can watch every single game now, whether it's on pay TV or live, but you can also watch every NBA game, and you can watch every EPL soccer game. And so that's all competing for people's entertainment. So we have to put on a great show. And I think it's everything from how hard it is to get to the venue to what happens pre-event, what happens post-event, because you're assessing that whole decision. Or do I stay home and watch it? And so it has to be, in our view, close to a CBD. Hence why the Hobart Stadium is positioned where it is, why we parlayed money into here, why Adelaide Oval went from a suburban ground into Adelaide Oval. And we are just absolutely convinced that that's the right way forward. The new stadium in Queensland, where it's located, again, same principles. How close is it to the CBD? How close is it to public transport? How close is it to amenity? So there's all of those things that go into it. You have to be able to get to the ground well. You've got to be able to enjoy something pre-game, post-game, and then enjoy the experience. And that's the way to ensure that the game is rich with attendees, which is a really important aspect to us. Again, COVID taught us when you're watching a game with no one there, it's a suboptimal experience. So ensuring that we have full stadiums is one of our most important things, and then that makes it a great broadcast product, which then that drives our economy. And so to answer your question, Max, I think unless they completely transformed Waverley with a train line and a whole lot of amenity with restaurants and bars and all those things, we just couldn't see how that would ever work. And because you couldn't really put an underground car park there either, it just was impossible to see how that could have been a longer sustainable stadium into the future like this is. So.
You touched on the sports ecosystem in Australia at the Sporting Experience. You're a landlord here at Marvel. Yeah. So we know that the AFL attracts enormous media rights and a huge economy. But how do you stay ahead of the curve with the other competing sports whilst still encouraging a healthy sports ecosystem?
Oh, look, it's a critical part of our longer term strategy. So we talk about having thrilling football. And thrilling football to us is ensuring that with 2 minutes to go, anyone can win. And ensuring that when you turn up to a game, your team has a chance to win. There's not many competitions, I think, that can boast that. I think we are pretty close to that at the moment. If you have a look at the West Coast Geelong game last week in West Coast almost got the Richmond versus GWS as well. Both of those teams, bottom of the ladder, but really competitive against the top performing teams. Now, there's a lot of work that goes into that. Everything from rule changes to competitive balance. We're the only sport that has a salary cap and what we call a soft cap. And so that's ensuring that the amount of money that's spent on football performance, so that's everything from training camps to coaches' salaries to physios, doctors, etc., that it's an even playing field. And the third part then is ensuring that from a funding perspective, that we try and keep our clubs as level as possible from a financial perspective. Now, that's hard when you've got big clubs who have strategic benefits, like a Collingwood, who've got 150 years of history, versus a GWS or a Gold Coast that have 10 years. And so we then try and compensate for that through the funding models to try and keep that. Because, again, if clubs get too far away, like you see in other sports, then really there's only 2 or 3 clubs that can win. And we think that is a poorer competition, which then is a poorer outcome for fans, etc. So that's just, I suppose, if you think about our flywheel, and we talk about this a lot, our flywheel basically is if we can have an unbelievable football product that people want to come and watch, whether it's on TV or attendance, that drives our economy. That drives all of the money in the game. We then, as a not-for-profit, we take that money and we invest that into grassroots. So again, we're very unique because we run the game from top to bottom, from Auskick to junior competition to community football to the talent pathways to the elite. So that whole ecosystem, if we continue to invest in our talent, which we do, we've committed 10% of revenue will always go into talent. Just to give you a feel for numbers, that's about 100 million now that goes into grassroots. No other sport in Australia does that. It's why Auskick is the most affordable product than any. If your kids are looking at whether it's basketball, cricket, soccer, Auskick will always be the most affordable. Yep. And we take a lot of pride with that. We also take a lot of pride in making the game as affordable as possible. Our GA ticket price hasn't increased in 8 years. So $27 has been the case since 2017. If you think about all of the CPI pressures that we've had, but we are committed to ensuring our game is affordable and accessible. And so go back to the flywheel. Great game at the top, generates money, push that into grassroots football, create as much talent as we can. The more talent that we have, the better product that we'll have. And that's our I suppose, circle of life in the AFL economy. And that hopefully keeps us as competitive to all of the competition that we're facing at the moment. And then it's about making sure that we have great personalities, that people can relate to them, and ensuring that all of the stars of our game that people want to role model. And then that gets you into, the challenges that we have when something goes a little bit off the radar, that we want to make sure that our players, whether they like it or not, they are role models. And it's a really important part of our game because of that circle of our economy.
Yeah, look, it certainly seems that AFL, well, it doesn't seem, it is the fact that AFL is the envy of pretty much every other code in this country. And there's so much to be learned from the way AFL operates compared to some of the other codes that are still struggling at the moment, particularly at the top levels, but all the way down to that grassroots. So without getting too detailed into your specific strategy, because that's obviously going to be AFL confident, what would be the key things other codes should consider just to try and improve the way they're breaking through, noting that ultimately they're your competitors?
Yeah, we talk about this a lot. The unique parts of our competition is we don't have any private ownership, and so all of the clubs are owned by their members. And then we have an independent commission that are making decisions in the best interest of the game. And so that was a crucial change to our economy when each of the clubs and presidents were, I suppose, running the game, go back 30, 40 years ago. Then having an independent commission that's there to make the best decisions for the game has been, I think, a really important aspect. Then having an eye on ensuring a competitive framework and all of the things we've put in place, which is the scrutiny of a lot of debate and a lot of discussion. But those competitive balance elements that I talked about before enable the game to be great. And then the third piece then is ensuring that you're managing the code from the grassroots all the way through, and don't break off and have other organisations looking after that, because then you're not aligned, and then it's very hard to be able to get consistency in terms of what you're trying to drive.
So amazing lessons there. The other CEOs and heads of sports should be listening to what you're saying.
It's much harder to bring, I suppose, put the genie back into the bottle once it's out.
That's true.
I think that's one of the challenges. So.
Yeah, international expansion, Matthew. We've seen, obviously, rugby league's foray into Vegas being pretty successful. International rules for the AFL over the years and different forms of that.
Yeah.
Where is the policy currently at as far as that's concerned?
Yeah, so we talk about this a lot too, and it's challenging because of the unique, like we're an Indigenous game. It's a unique game, and it's not played anywhere outside of Australia other by expats. And so rugby, NRL has a bit of an advantage there because I think people can understand the game a bit easier than ours. So that's a challenge. It's also an opportunity, but what we're really focused on at the moment is the changing face of Australia. So Australia, as we all know, has changed significantly over the last 30 years. The multicultural facet of Australia, where particularly from Asia, whether it's Chinese or Indian, is you can go to suburbs where there is significant segments of that cohort in those areas, and most of them don't really understand footy at all. It's just not. So we think the opportunity is to break into those markets. How can we make our game attractive to those markets? And that could be different formats, different ways of them enjoying our game. And there's a lot going on in that space. If we can get some traction there and get more participation, maybe in a different format, then I think we have an opportunity to take that format to, whether it's India or China or the US, wherever, where we've got this cohort who are supporting the game, and that's starting to get traction, I suppose, locally, and then becomes internationally. We just think the opportunity is so great here. We want to ensure that our game is sustainable in Australia before we start taking it offshore. And whilst we're very sustainable with people who have grown up with our game, it's not very sustainable for people who don't know our game. And that's the area we're focusing on.
One more question about Docklands since we're here. I gather from the history, looking it up, that when it was built, cost about $450 million. This is in 2000, so adjusted for inflation, it's roughly double, 900 mil. I look at this and I go, there's no way you would build this for $900 million today. I mean, do you think that's right? What do you reckon it would cost to replace an asset like this today?
Yeah, totally. We sort of think about it in seat numbers. So there's, let's use some easy numbers, 50,000 seats here. There's a bit more, but just for the ease of this discussion. And then it's cost per seat. And so, you know, the Hobart Stadium, we modelled not far off this stadium in terms of the dimensions. We've got 3 levels here. We only need 2 levels in Tasmania, 23,000 seats in Tasmania. And so that stadium will be, at the moment, it's 950 million. If you sort of do the maths there, you're getting to 40 to 50 bucks per seat. If you run that through here, you're at 2 billion, right? So now Tasmania is a little bit more expensive just because of its location. But to give you maybe another example, Optus Stadium was 1.6 billion. That's 60,000 people. Go back, that was sort of 2016. The math's sort of $30 a seat, roughly. So it's sort of somewhere between $30 to $40 a seat. And so you're in $1.5 to $2 billion.
Yeah, what do you think's behind that? I mean, it's such an extraordinary increase above the underlying inflation. Why is it costing so much more to build this sort of thing?
Yeah. Look, I think stadiums require a lot more things than what they did also 40 years ago. So use Wi-Fi, for example. So there was no such thing as Wi-Fi when we built this. You know, the backbone of the Wi-Fi here to ensure that we have 5G and Wi-Fi for everyone. And what is really important now is being able to stream a video and send it. And again, you can't do that at many venues. You can do that here because we've invested heavily in the backbone, again, with Telstra, who was a great partner here. But that's 30 to 40 million just for that. Right. And so if you then start taking that and you look at the scoreboards and the LED, again, none of that was that important back then. So I think a lot of the technology that's required in these stadiums, the security and integrity of the stadium becomes much more important. The playing surface, you know, they need to be pristine now, where back then, you know, go back and have a look at the tapes, you know, mud and those sorts of things. So I just think there's a lot more to it now, and the demands for customer comfort, the technology in everything that the customers want, but also the technology that, particularly in a multi-stadium like this, even things like the roof, ensuring that we have enough rigging capacity to hang things from the roof for concerts. So all of those things weren't thought about back 25 years ago. And because you need to ensure the stadium can generate lots of revenue from lots of different things, they're all adding costs that weren't around 20, 30 years ago.
Well, Matthew, thank you for your insights and the invite.
Pleasure.
If this is your backyard, I'd love to see your dining room.
Yeah. No, we love it here, and look forward to hosting you in this room at a game soon.
Good on you, Matthew.
Can't wait.
Thanks,
you.
guys. Thank you.
Max, that was an absolutely fascinating chat. What about the intel that Matthew gave us towards the AFL policy on so many different areas?
Yeah, I mean, look, a wealth of knowledge, and, you know, one of the most important people in AFL, as we've found out through the Herald Sun recently. Look, he knows so much about the ins and outs of the game, about where this succeeding so well strategically and building up, you know, from that grassroots, which is such an important learning, I think, for a lot of the other codes. And just the ability to sort of roll out a very significant infrastructure program the way they have through challenging times is incredible to hear about.
I think the clarity of the AFL strategy, as articulated by Matthew, was just intriguing, wasn't it? Even to the detail of their international expansion, the use of AFLW to connect communities, it was all there.
Yeah, it's such a cohesive strategy. And again, I keep saying that, you know, you've got these other codes that are struggling, and you've got the best example here in the AFL. Why aren't we learning from that more?
Well, we've had 2 cracking guests, haven't we? Andrew Westacott in episode 1, the former CEO of Australian F1, the Grand Prix and MotoGP, and now Matthew. It's been brilliant.
We've set the bar high.
Can we continue, Max?
Absolutely we will.
Okay, well, we'll see you next time.